Hey guys, welcome back to the channel McNallie Money, home of all things stock, investment, and personal finance related. Now for today's video, we've got a special guest for you, Nico Moran, who's the host of Simply Bitcoin. This is a channel that puts out daily content in relation to Bitcoin, cryptocurrency, and the impact it's having on our society. So I'm super curious to hear Nico's thoughts on some of the big macro events that we're currently seeing, such as the presidential election, the spot Bitcoin ETFs, and the halving coming up next year. Now before we get into all that, please take a second, hit the like button, you guys. It's a big help to myself and the channel. If you're not already subscribed, McNallie Money, feel free to join. And let me know in the comment section below what your thoughts are on our discussion, if you're holding Bitcoin yourself, and what your price target is for the back half of this year. Now with that being said, let's get into today's interview. Okay guys, so that's right. Today's video, we've got a special guest for you, another YouTuber who's amassed a big following in the Bitcoin and cryptocurrency space. His name is Nico Moran. He's the host of Simply Bitcoin and the content strategy manager at Swan Bitcoin. Nico, thanks so much for being with us today. We really appreciate your time.
Happy to be here, man. I'm excited.
Great. So yeah, we were having a little bit of dialogue before we flipped on the camera here, but can you give us a little bit of background, Nico, on how you got into the Bitcoin space, maybe your orange pill moment, as they say, and what Simply Bitcoin's all about?
Yeah, my orange pill moment. Wow. That was back in 2016. I was not in a good place in my life, and I saw Bitcoin as an opportunity to kind of get out of that like little rut that I was in, and I went all in. I just, I sold everything that I had, borrowed money from my mother, borrowed money from my ex-girlfriend, maxed out my credit cards, just went all in Bitcoin, and I've never looked back. And Bitcoin's given me purpose. It's giving me a career. It's it's giving me this network that I would have never have thought possible if you would have told me this those many years ago. And Simply is something that I started in 2020. I noticed that a lot of the altcoin channels were very good at YouTubing, and what we had on the Bitcoin side was podcasts. And I figured, I'm like, okay, let's do some type of in between using the tips and tricks and the tactics that a lot of these altcoin channels use to get so big so fast, and let's just apply it to Bitcoin only content. And at the time it was a theory, but to my surprise, it was pretty well received by the community, by the Bitcoin community. And that got invited me to Bitcoin 2021, which was like the first very big Bitcoin conference. And it was in Miami. And that was the conference where Jack Mallers made his famous announcement with Nayib Bukele and made Bitcoin legal tender. My first crucible fire, like, so to speak, they put me on the main stage. I've never been on there before. And, they asked me some questions about Simply Bitcoin. I told them, I was like, this is what I think is going to work. And fast forward a couple of years later, and, it's just interesting how things have played out, to say the least.
Yeah, that's great. I've got a lot of questions for you. It's funny you were thrown in the deep end there, and you must have done pretty well, I guess, to make it here. I know you've amassed a pretty good Twitter following as well, so I'll leave your social medias linked in the video description, Nico. But it's really interesting how you say you got into Bitcoin, because I had a similar story. Kind of looked at it as an investment or a stock almost, and then you get involved. You see it's a kind of a lifestyle and a mindset shift, and then the freedom that comes around with it, and now all the adoption from some of the big like BlackRock and government agencies and stuff. So I wanted to talk about Simply Bitcoin specifically in a couple seconds here, but we've had a ton of news in the media. Michael Saylor's buying a bunch more Bitcoin. We saw BlackRock as a big holder of MicroStrategy itself. What do you think's happening kind of at the macro level in terms of the general public's outlook on Bitcoin and some of the big money, smart money getting involved now?
Yeah. So the general public, I think it depends what general public we're talking about. Like in the countries that have a relatively stable fiat currency, I think the general public is still very much distracted by the bread and circuses and, the comfort of living, and the inflation rate isn't so high enough for people to really start asking the question, what is money? But in the developing world, whether that's Nigeria, Argentina, Venezuela, Turkey, you name it, right? It's like 60% of the world doesn't have a stable fiat currency. You see massive Bitcoin adoption there. I think the rates last time I checked is anywhere between 20 to 35% of the population is using a non-government currency. Now, that's not to say it's Bitcoin specifically. I think it's mostly a popularity in stable coins from what I'm seeing. Of course, there's Bitcoin adoption, but the thing about stable coins is that they provide a false sense of financial sovereignty due to their centralization. So I think that they inevitably will be co-opted by governments. But it's good because it gets people's foot in the door. It gets people to get comfortable with a currency that's not issued by the state, by the government. And that is a big leap for a lot of people because they've been conditioned to think in a certain way for so long. But I think that veneer is slowly starting to go away. And I think people are slowly starting to wake up to that. But like I said, it's farther away from, it's not happening in the West how normally the technological adoption would normally happen. It's happening everywhere else first, right? Which makes total sense, but at the same time, it's an interesting phenomenon.
It totally is. Yeah, it's almost backwards if you think about it. The new cutting edge digital currency, and it's the third world countries that are really pioneering. Now, I wanted to bring it back home here. You mentioned you're in Miami. There's a big election, obviously, next year in the States. A lot of the presidential candidates have come out in support of self-custody, of Bitcoin, of crypto. What are your thoughts there? Do you think this is going to be a major, pillar for the election? Or do you think this is just kind of smoke and mirrors to keep people happy?
I think politicians will say anything and everything to get elected. But that's not to say that some of them aren't on our side. What's interesting is you have two candidates, actually three. You have two on the Republican side, and you have one on the Democratic side that are in second and third place for the Republican presidential candidacy and the Democratic presidential candidacy. And RFK Jr. flat out said at the Bitcoin conference, I'll protect your right to self-custody. Now, as Bitcoiners, you're just kind of like, I could do that anyways. But it's interesting that the Overton window, so to speak, like the political discourse has gotten to this point. And then what I say is like, look, if you have a Republican and a Democrat both advocating against central bank digital currencies and advocating for Bitcoin, like statistically speaking, there's a non-zero chance we have a pro-Bitcoin, anti-central bank digital currency president in the White House in 2024. Now, is that probable? No. But I could tell you that it's better than what we have now. The Biden administration has been hell-bent. They've been completely against Bitcoin. I had Caitlin Long. I had the privilege of having Caitlin Long on my podcast, and she's like, look, like the Custodia Bank, which was essentially this Bitcoin crypto bank that she is launching, better said, in Wyoming. They weren't able to get a federal banking charter because, they got denied. And then she straight up said, she's like, that order came directly from the White House. And then you have the infamous choke point 2.0, which is, this directive or this theory where the administration is trying to isolate the industry from the rest of the financial system. Now, you could say, right, that they're truly just going after crypto scams and all that stuff. And as a Bitcoiner, I'm not a big fan of crypto, but at the same time, I'm also a libertarian. And I also take the angle of like, let's let the free market decide what the free market decides. I'm not a fan of a government intervention in any type of situation. But yeah, it's a very interesting situation. Let's see how this all plays out. But listen, I think Bitcoin's incentives are going to win, and I think that inevitably leads to politicians using that as a political slogan in order to get more votes. I think it's going to be politically unfeasible by 2028, which is the next presidential election, to take an anti-Bitcoin stance just because of the percentage of the population that are holding Bitcoin.
Agreed. Yeah, good comments there. And it is interesting to see anytime both sides of the aisle agree on anything, it's definitely got a little bit of merit. So it kind of brings me back. I used to do a lot of coverage of the cannabis sector, and seeing how much the government can really shut down an industry by not allowing access to banking and cash only and tax implication. They can do a lot, right? So I'm optimistic. I think you're right. We're moving in the right direction, and we'll see, I guess, how the chips fall next year. So next kind of question on the macro level for you, Nico. The SEC, very closely intertwined with the government. Since we're on that topic, spot ETFs, that's the big kind of, I guess, bullish case right now for Bitcoin. A lot of interest, a lot of dollars flowing in. What do you think is going to happen there? Are they going to unanimously approve them all? Do you think BlackRock's going to get out ahead? Do you think it'll happen before the end of the year here? What's your stance?
Yeah, so I had Elliot Johnson on, I think it was on Swan, on one of the live streams that we did for Swan, and he believes that the BlackRock, and Elliot Johnson, just to give a little bit of context, is just throwing a name out there. Elliot Johnson was behind the first spot Bitcoin ETF in Canada. It was called the Evolve Bitcoin ETF. And he believes that the BlackRock ETF has a very high probability of being approved. But then you have Bitcoiners that take a different stance. Joe Carlasari, which is, this known for his legal input. I think he has a legal background, practices law. He doesn't believe that it's going to get approved. So the community's kind of divided. Now, I think that it could be beneficial for price. But at the same time, I think we have to be wary of the dangers of rehypothecation and the dangers of paper Bitcoin. And I had this tweet pinned to the top of my profile for the longest time. And basically it said, if enough people take self-custody, we'll win this thing no matter what they do. And that's like the key differentiator between Bitcoin and all these other assets, including gold. Like, take self-custody of gold. Like, I look, personally, like, as a Bitcoiner, and maybe a lot of people will get upset with me, I like gold, but like, I like physical gold. Like, if you hold a gold bar in your hand, it feels nice. But try holding $1 million, $2 million, $5 million worth of gold in your hand. It's heavy. You're going to have to pay security guards. You're going to have to pay transportation. You're going to have to get a big truck. With Bitcoin, it's like, if you're in a pickle, you can memorize 12 words and you can theoretically store millions, billions, trillions of dollars in your mind. And that empowers individuals, right? But only if individuals choose to use that empowerment. And that is the catch 22. Like, that's why I'm wary of this BlackRock ETF, where if enough people on Wall Street, or enough of the older generation, which happens to have all the wealth, they get comfortable and they're like, oh, I could just log into my Charles Schwab account and I could just buy this BlackRock ETF. I'll get exposure to Bitcoin. Like, that's not going to change anything. The way that things change is if people take a little bit of personal responsibility and take their wealth, their time, their energy back into their own hands, control their own destiny. And they do that by controlling their seed words. They can do that, but they do that by controlling their keys. So it's a two-edged sword. Like, yes, could it be a good for price action? Yes, but there's a danger there as well. And as a Bitcoiner, I'm cautiously optimistic about this whole thing.
Yeah, that's an interesting angle, and I like how you brought up both sides. And you're totally right. The easier, more accessible, mainstream we make it, the more it becomes just like everything else, kind of thing, right? So, yeah, the self custody is a big thing. I too hold gold and silver bullion. I've never had the problem of having to move around $1 million worth of gold, luckily. So I don't have that issue, but I hear you that it's not as divisible, it's not as transportable, all the rest. So now zeroing in a little bit, Nico, this is awesome dialogue. I really appreciate your insight there. And obviously, you've got the opportunity to meet a lot of experts in the space. Simply Bitcoin, can you tell us a little bit specifically about that? What's kind of been the general tone or discussion points on your recent episodes?
Yeah, so we're a daily news show, and we cover, our motto is we'll be your number one source for the peaceful Bitcoin revolution. And what we're seeing really is the separation of money and state, and we're watching it in slow motion. And this has been something theorized by the book The Sovereign Individual that was written in the 90s. And a lot of the predictions that they made, it was two gentlemen, have come true, right? And what you're watching is what I call the great disintermediation. And you're watching these mechanisms of control be disintermediated in real time. But it's not just Bitcoin, it's information. Information actually started with the internet. And now you have individuals being able to talk directly with each other like we're doing so right now, hundreds, if not thousands of miles away from each other instantaneously. And they do that through different social media platforms, whether that's Twitter, YouTube. And what that creates is individuals no longer seek information through the approved mainstream, so-called mainstream. I don't call it mainstream anymore. I call it corporate media, legacy media, sources, of which governments have successfully used those sources in order to control the narrative for a long time, and control the discourse. And now that's being disintermediated, and it's causing some chaos, right? There's movements in Canada and the US. They tried to create, the Ministry of Truth, so to speak, to only allow, approved information sources and stuff like that. But you have independent media exponentially growing, like Tucker just dropping episodes on Twitter. You have the Joe Rogan podcast, the most popular broadcaster in the world. It's an independent, that's just a guy, right? And he's not saying the approved narratives or what the establishment media would allow. So it's very interesting to watch that disintermediation. And there's a bit of an overlap, and that overlap is the disintermediation of money. And that's what's happening as well. So both those things are happening, and both those things take power I can't think of another word to describe this. It takes power from these well-entrenched, established institutions that have been in power for decades and decades and decades. And what it does is it empowers individuals. So you're seeing the balance of power shift from the state back to the individual, and you're seeing individuals empowered because of the internet and because of what the internet has enabled, like technologies like Bitcoin, like Nostr, right? Where like even the idea of deplatforming is just, you can't do it. You can't censor that person. So if you can't censor that person, then you have to have dialogue with that person. That person, you're going to have to speak with them. And I think what the long-term effects of that is a society with aligned incentives. And I think that what's wrong in the Western world with governments and this corruption, and politicians get elected, and they're not so much concerned about doing good by their constituents. They're just concerned about staying in power and, milking, trying to get as close to the money spigot as possible. But I think it will align incentives in society in the long run. And I think that's what you're seeing in El Salvador. I think you're seeing a country that has aligned incentives, and I think that's why you're seeing the success that's happening there. It's too early to tell. That's just a theory. But the reason I'm saying that is because of what Bitcoin has done personally to my life, what Bitcoin has done to the people around me, what Bitcoin has done to companies that, I've been a part of and that I've seen. All of a sudden, when you live on a Bitcoin standard, the truth matters. integrity matters, honesty matters, and you start thinking thinking the long term versus the short term, which I think is what fiat incentivizes. It incentivizes you to think short term because of inflation, right? It's designed to lose purchasing power over time. And Bitcoin, it's designed to do the exact opposite, right? So yeah, I know I said a lot, but to kind of answer your question, that's what we try to cover on Simply Bitcoin, this phenomenon of the separation of money and state, the peaceful revolution, like I like to call it. And I think that the world's going to be a lot better place once we get over this hump that we inevitably have to go through, because I think there is going to be some type of clash, because I just think that governments are just not going to be okay with this. Like they're not, the amount of power that comes from being able to issue money that everyone else has to work for it's a godly power. Like I can't even put it into words. The military industrial complex relies on that. Like there's so many things, so many industries that rely on this privilege, because that's really what it is. Do you think they're just going to say, okay, you know what, you guys found sound money, it's great, we're going to just give up the money printer? Like the US spends $1 trillion more than it collects in tax revenue every single year. How is it able to do that? Yeah, and it still collects more tax revenue year after year, collects more tax revenue, but it still spends $1 trillion more than it collects. How do they cover the difference? They print the difference. And how are they going to stop that? You don't just stop that. So many people's job depends on that. Like the government depends on that. And that's what I'm seeing happen in slow motion. But that's why I call it a peaceful revolution. This is the separation of money and state. Humanity went through the separation of church and state. Hopefully this time it's a lot less violent than it was last time. But we'll see, man. All I know is I have Bitcoin in self-custody, and I'm just watching on the sidelines, eating popcorn and talking about it.
There you go. Yeah, time will tell, but I unfortunately agree with you. It's pretty rare for people to give up power peacefully. So we'll see where that intersection happens. But Nico, this was extremely helpful for me. Like I say, I started this journey with Bitcoin from a financial stock investing kind of mindset, and I'm quickly kind of evolving into that orange pill moment, right? It impacts every part of our life, the way we think, the way society works, the way we interact with people. So having guests like yourself on here is really helpful to kind of round that picture out. So hopefully we can have you back again soon. Again, I'll leave a link to all of your socials and everything so people can take a look for themselves. Check out Simply Bitcoin. You say it's a daily. Is it Monday to Friday, or when do you post on that one?
Yeah, it's Monday to Friday, and then we have special guests on Wednesday at 5 p.m. And we're dropping clips 7 days a week as well. So
Gotcha.
We're turning out a good amount of content, and you can just kind of check it out. And it's all Bitcoin content, and it all kind of comes from the lens that I just described. But yeah, man, thank you so much for having me. It's been an honor, and appreciate it. And I would love to come back. Just let me know.
That sounds great. Okay, guys, so if you're still watching, make sure you leave a comment and a like. Hopefully you found some value. If you're not subscribed to the channel, McNallie Money or Simply Bitcoin, feel free to join. We'd love to have you as part of the community. And if there's any questions you want us to cover in our next sit down here, leave them in the comment section below, and we'll try and get them on the list for you. So Nico, thanks again. We'll talk to you soon, buddy.